The Premier League is the envy of every boardroom in world football. Matchday, commercial, and especially broadcast revenue in the top flight of English football exceeds every other league in the world, allowing even bottom half Premier League teams to poach players from all but the very biggest and richest clubs everywhere else on the planet. The so-called Premier League success story extends to attendances as well. In the 2022-23 season, the average attendance in the top flight of English football throughout an entire season exceeded 40,000 for the very first time. In the final First Division season, in 1991-92, attendances were almost half of what they are now, at an average of 21,622. The same is true throughout the English Football League pyramid. Championship average attendances have risen from 10,525 to 23,052 from 1992 to 2024. League One attendances are up from 5,422 to 9,702 during that time, and League Two attendances are up from 3,404 to 6,271. It's easy to take these kinds of increases for granted, but this isn't the norm elsewhere in the world. During that same time, whilst Premier League attendances have risen by more than 80%, Bundesliga attendances have risen by less than 50%, La Liga attendances have flatlined, and Serie A attendances have actually fallen by a dramatic 40%. Although the Bundesliga has historically seen higher averages overall, no league in world sport, let alone football, has a higher average attendance as a percentage of overall capacity than the Premier League's 98.7%, and if current trends continue, this may well prove to be the first season in which the Premier League sees higher average attendances than the Bundesliga, making it the most watched league in the world both on television and live in the stadium. There's just one small problem. If Premier League attendances are setting all-time records, every stadium, yes, even the Etihad, is packed out almost every week, and several clubs have tens of thousands of fans sitting on waiting lists, the obvious elephant in the room is, why can't they seem to make any noise? This is a complaint that I've heard for at least as long as I can remember, but never has it been more prominent than this season, and a recent clip of Jamie Redknapp on Sky Sports complaining about Manchester United's home game against Chelsea being like watching a game in COVID, sent the internet ablaze with discourse surrounding why Premier League stadiums have become about as raucous as a night at the opera. So, like all good YouTubers, which I am slowly consigning to accept is my profession now, having been doing it for over 7 years, I'm jumping on the bandwagon and attempting to figure out why Premier League stadiums are quieter than Peter Mandelson when asked about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, despite being packed to the rafters, why atmospheres have got so much worse in recent years, and why crowds outside of England appear so much more vociferous. If we take a good atmosphere to mean a loud one, which I think is what people are most commonly referring to, when analysing why atmospheres may be good or bad, it's worth first considering who makes the most noise and makes atmospheres good by extension. It can be easy to overcomplicate these sorts of things, but the answer is largely young people, and predominantly young men, and in the case of English football, historically, it has tended to be drunk young men. We can split hairs about what constitutes young, my definition is slowly creeping up the older I get, whether gender really matters. I must say I was shocked by how loud, albeit an octave or two higher and with a much friendlier tone, the atmosphere was at the Women's Euros, and how important a role alcohol plays. Some of the noisiest atmospheres in the world can be found in Muslim countries like Turkey, Indonesia, and Iran, where alcohol consumption is very low, but a 25-year-old West Ham fan who has sunk a few pints with his mates before kick-off, as a general rule, is likely to be a bit more boisterous inside of a stadium than a 75-year-old woman whose pre-match routine consisted of a cup of tea and popping her teeth back in. Is that ageist? I hope that's not ageist. Look, it's not my fault if Dorothy didn't look after her teeth. It might have been all of the crystal meth that she took in her 60s. Please don't jump to conclusions. The reality is that, while the numbers have increased, the profile of fan attending games in the top flight of English football has shifted dramatically over the last 10, 25, or 50 years. In 1977, the average age of a supporter in the notoriously boisterous Stretford End at Old Trafford was just 17. By 2008, 3 decades later, it had risen to over 40, meaning the average age had more than doubled. The average age of a Newcastle United supporter at St James's Park overall as recently as 2002 was 35, yet by 2012 that had reportedly risen to over 45, an increase of over 10 years, or nearly 30%, in the space of just 10 years. It was as though no new Geordies had appeared within the space of an entire decade. Which surely can't be right, because I keep seeing new ones popping up all the time telling me that the Saudi Arabian royal family are just badly misunderstood. In the 2012-13 season, the average age of a match-going Premier League fan was 41. That was over 10 years ago, but the Premier League hasn't provided updated information on the age profile of the league's crowd since then, and there is a good reason for that. If they did, it would almost certainly confirm the suspicion that Premier League crowds have continued to get older since then, and quite possibly much older. If current trends continue, by 2050, the average age of a Premier League crowd will be similar to that of a reunion of World War I veterans. We don't have to see the data that the Premier League no longer discloses to know this. Anyone who has regularly attended football matches in England over the last 10, 20 or 30 years will have seen the heads around them, including their own I suppose, get greyer, wrinklier and balder. And I'm just talking about the women. I recently sat in the West Stand at Hull City for a cup game, which is where I used to have a season ticket as a kid, and the average age was just a little bit older than your average care home. The most noise that they made all game wasn't when we scored or when the referee made a poor decision, but when Harold, 86 from Howden, asked if anyone would like a Werther's original. My dad, who recently turned 60 himself, said that he hadn't felt that young in decades. That's not my dad, by the way. That is a stock image. He also joked that he'd be surprised if some of them made it through to full time, but I wasn't sure whether to include that in case it made him seem callous and insensitive. Oh well. Too late now, I suppose. I jest, and I don't want anyone here to think that I'm actually being mean about old people. In a world that is increasingly atomised, the fact that the Hull City fans that I'm referring to are still able to attend games and socialise with their friends is heartwarming to me. But the fossilisation of English football crowds hasn't happened by accident. A small part of it is just demographics. The UK has had falling birth rates and an ageing population, and therefore more older people for a while now, and that trend is only accelerating. So there are more older people in general, not just in football stadiums, but the biggest factor is economic. A 17-year-old could afford to watch Manchester United in 1977, which is why there were so many of them in the Stretford End, just as a young adult on an average salary could just about justify a season ticket at Newcastle United or most other Premier League clubs in 2002. Fast forward to 2024, and for two key reasons, that is no longer the case. One, young people have far less disposable income. We don't have to get into Thatcherism or austerity, but it turns out that making a handful of people richer than God and slashing public services isn't actually a one-stop shop to economic prosperity and a high standard of living for the masses, with young people, and by young I mean anyone under 40, arguably even under 50, given that we are now approaching 20 years of stagnant wages in real terms, which is the longest period of economic stagnation in the UK since the Napoleonic War, are now faced with low wages, extortionate housing costs, and very little left over for luxuries like watching live sporting events. And two, football has been financialised beyond any and all comprehension during the Premier League era, resulting in soaring ticket prices and general costs associated with following a football club. In the 1989-90 season, a ticket to watch Liverpool at Anfield in the Kop cost £4. Even factoring in inflation, that is less than £10 today. In the 2024-25 season, the cheapest ticket in the Kop cost £39, an increase of 875% or over 300% in real terms. Liverpool are far from an isolated, or even the most extreme example. A season ticket in the lower standard Old Trafford only climbed above £100, so £270 in today's money, for the first time in the 1988-89 season, and in the last season before the breakaway of the Premier League, it was still below £200. Now the cheapest season ticket at Old Trafford will cost you around £600, and the most expensive, not including any hospitality tickets, over £1,000. That's child's play compared to the most expensive season ticket at Arsenal, which is over £2,000, at Tottenham, which is over £2,300, and at Fulham, who have the nerve to charge £3,000 for a season ticket. There is a non-hospitality matchday ticket at Chelsea that costs £240 sterling, meanwhile the average matchday ticket throughout the league costs £36 and 80p. In the 1970s, possibly even into the 80s depending upon the club, it was literally cheaper to go and watch a top-flight game of football than it was to go and watch a film at the cinema. Of course, there are lots of reasons why that has changed, including the slow death of cinema, and the reality is that record prices hasn't stopped record attendances or record waiting lists, and, stark as this may sound, Premier League clubs, greedy as they may be, probably actually undersell themselves in terms of ticket prices. That is to say, they could increase prices by 10 to 20% or even 30 to 40% in the case of the best supported clubs, with next to no drop-off in attendance numbers. Ticket prices, as extortionate as they have become, are still artificially lowered for reasons of public relations, and the fans being part of the product, to quote, a truly vomit-inducing term, as is evidenced by the £30 cap on away tickets, which still often sold out for higher prices before that cap was introduced. If Premier League teams wanted to, at least at Anfield, Old Trafford and the Emirates for example, they could price their tickets like American sports teams, cutting off not just working class fans but even most middle class ones, and still sell out. But, as I alluded to there, that would further alter the profile of match-going fans beyond recognition. Tourists get a lot of the blame for poor Premier League atmospheres, and I remember I was struck when I first visited Anfield or Old Trafford by the number of people to whom attending a game seemed more akin to visiting Madame Tussauds or the Tower of London than it did to my own ritualistic misery of following Hull City. As of 2015, it was reported that 800,000 tourists attended Premier League games annually, so it would probably be safe to assume that with increased capacities and the Premier League's ever-increasing profile overseas, that figure is likely now in excess of 1 million. That accounts for around 7% of overall Premier League attendances, although I think it's also safe to assume that there is a concentration at the big 6 clubs compared to, say, Bournemouth or Ipswich, which is more than I imagined and is likely a minor factor, but it is still only 7% all the same. Far more consequential, in my view, is just the much older, wealthier, and quieter profile of fan in general, whether they were born and live in Wythenshawe or Wisconsin, Stoke Newington or Shanghai, Bourneville or Beijing. I could keep doing those forever. It's also important to note, and I don't want to get too deep into this because it could be an entire video in its own right, and maybe it is one that I should make, but there was effectively a war on football fans in this country, intensified after Liverpool fans were shamefully blamed in a police, media and state-sanctioned cover-up when 97 of their own fans died in the Hillsborough disaster, and unlike the supposed war on drugs or the war in Afghanistan, this one was broadly successful. Margaret Thatcher hated football fans, and the Thatcher government went to war with fan culture during the 1980s. Some of that, built upon during the Blair and Major years, you could argue, was a positive and welcome intervention. In the 1970s and into the 80s, English football did have a serious problem with hooliganism and regular outbreaks of violence and disorder. That is one of the reasons why attendances reached historically low levels during the 80s, because stadiums in England weren't especially safe or welcoming environments. It's also, incidentally, one of the reasons why the crowds were so young and, among many other things it must be said, so male. Older people, again painting with a broad brush, tend to be less keen on having a tear up on the terraces or getting hit over the head with a brick. You don't have to feel bad for him, he was participating in a race riot. The lesson of this absolutely isn't that you can't have good atmospheres without having hooliganism or violence, although it must be said the likes of Turkey, Poland, Indonesia, Argentina, or even the Netherlands, where hooliganism is still a much bigger problem than it is in England, do have some of the best atmospheres, but they don't have to go hand in hand. Bulgarian football sees frequent violence and even lethal encounters, but attendances are weak and atmospheres outside of the biggest teams and the biggest games are poor, whereas German stadiums are as safe as those in England, while boasting some of the best atmospheres in Europe. We will come back to Germany, but the point is, England adopted a very hard line towards football fans and fan culture, implementing a mass surveillance campaign and dishing out banning orders to unruly supporters. Thatcher even introduced compulsory identity cards for all football fans through the specifically targeted Football Spectators Act of 1989, a policy which was so controversial and hated that it was never actually implemented. It might be hard for younger football fans to understand at a time when everyone seems to be a football fan, or at least pretends to be one when it is politically convenient, such as during tournaments, and pays routine lip service to fans because they are a powerful social, economic, and electoral force. At the time, there were few people of any power making the case for fans. It was politically expedient and even popular to give football fans a good kicking, and Thatcher had no hesitation in doing just that. Although ID cards were never implemented, other measures were, and the sense in which football fans are treated as criminals, almost with a degree of assumed guilt by the police, still endures to this day. Anyone who regularly follows their team away from home will be very familiar with that feeling, whether it is being penned in by the police after games, made to walk a certain longer route out of the ground, or hordes of police horses doing little other than creating an assault course of horse turds throughout the perimeter of a stadium. Despite the fact that English football fans have engaged in little disorder, and English stadiums have been remarkably safe for about 2 to 3 decades. Curbing violent disorder didn't kill atmospheres, and personally, I'm delighted that football is now a safe environment for women, kids, men included, and families of course, but some of the tools used to crack down on supporters, which continue to be used even now that the problem is practically non-existent, undoubtedly further impact the profile of supporters and their propensity to create vocal and stirring atmospheres that we laud elsewhere on the continent where supporters aren't treated this way. A final point in regards to pricing and the profile of fans has to be the explosion in hospitality at Premier League grounds. While clubs prefer tourists to season ticket holders from a revenue perspective because they are more likely to spend longer in the stadium and buy more food, drink, and most importantly merchandise, the real money and the real margins come from the corporate sectors. The cheapest hospitality ticket for Arsenal's upcoming home game against Manchester United costs £1,100. Meanwhile, the cheapest box for a season will set you back around 60 grand. Chelsea and Manchester City both offer packages which cost in excess of £4,000 for a single ticket to a single game. This is where there is real money to be made. It wouldn't be a problem, ripping off rich people with more money than sense that is, if it was used to subsidise ticket for fans who don't own hedge funds, but one, it doesn't, they are still price gouged, as we've already established, just to a lesser extent, and two, because corporate and hospitality clients, again, a sickening term, are so profitable, clubs are constantly looking to increase the size of their hospitality suites and the number of seats which are dedicated to hospitality tickets. Just take Wembley Stadium, or the new Wembley, as it was known for many years. Club Wembley, the stadium's hospitality division, occupies a potential 15,000 of the stadium's 90,000 seats, which includes the entire middle tier, the Bobby Moore Suite, which is 2 whole blocks in the lower tier, and a further 160 boxes. That is why the new Wembley has already hosted 3 Champions League finals, a Euros final, a Women's Euros final, and will host a second Men's Euros final in 2028. Because it makes you weigh for a lot of money. It's also a big reason why Real Madrid and Barcelona have both recently undergone or are undergoing massive renovations at the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou, why moving stadiums was so crucial to Tottenham, Everton, West Ham, and many other clubs with high demand, and Ultimately, it is part of the reason why atmospheres have got so much worse. Here is a clip by the VIP and hospitality company Seat Unique, no advertisement to be clear, just crediting the video, showing the hospitality experience at Old Trafford.
3 hours before kickoff and we're already here at this amazing venue, just a short walk from the ground. This place is perfect for avoiding the crowds and soaking up the pre-match atmosphere in style. There were so many tasty food choices. They had tacos and burgers, plus all of my drinks were included. I could choose from beers, prosecco, spirits, and all the soft drinks. And we were given a match day program too.
Yep, looks classmate. Word of advice, if you really want to avoid the crowds, how about not going to a fucking football match, you daft lemon?
This place is perfect for avoiding the crowds and soaking up the pre-match atmosphere in style.
Oh yeah, no. The pre-match atmosphere. You can't beat it. Here is the pre-match atmosphere at a recent River Plate game. Now back to the Manchester United hospitality one.
This place is perfect for avoiding the crowds and soaking up the pre-match atmosphere in style.
Oh no, you're right. That pre-match atmosphere really is something else. Soak it up, baby. You don't get table football, street food, and a sense of impending doom from people speaking like they're on LinkedIn quite like that anywhere else. Not to state the obvious, but returning to atmospheres, do you imagine that the increasingly large number of people full of Prosecco and smoked salmon and caviar canapes occupying these seats are likely to be very raucous sat in their padded seats or break out into a chorus of "Who the f***ing hell are you?" anytime soon? They're more likely to start chanting that at the plebs in the cheap seats than they are at the opposition, in between grumbling about a rise in capital gains tax. I mentioned Germany a moment ago as an example of a country with excellent atmospheres but where people don't tend to get killed, which I think is preferable. And if England is getting lots of things wrong, leading to bad atmospheres, it's worth asking what the Germans are getting right, leading to good ones. When I was really young, there was a crap old joke in English football along the lines of, what do German football stadiums and the moon have in common? Answer, there's no atmosphere. Ha, ha, ha. Oh, how the tables turn. Of course, that joke has aged badly in multiple ways, as we now know that the moon does have an atmosphere. It is just a very thin one known as an exosphere, made up of helium, argon, neon, ammonia, methane, and carbon dioxide. And that, right there, is a bit of trivia that not many other people have mentioned in the discussions around Premier League atmospheres. The German stadium experience differs from the English one in a number of ways. Firstly, the tickets are much cheaper, making attending games more accessible to a greater number of people, including more young and working class people. Secondly, there is safe standing, allowing fans who wish to stand on the terraces, as used to be the case in England when stadiums were much louder, to do so. And thirdly, you can drink alcohol on the terraces or in your seats. Look, I don't want to paint it as a silver bullet here, but drunk people, again, do tend to be louder. I don't make the rules. Again, none of this is by accident. It feels as though attending football matches in Germany is a fan-centered experience, and the reason for that, very simply, is because German football fans have genuine power, a unified voice on a lot of issues, and they wield that power to great effect. Unlike English football fans, particularly in the Premier League, who are weak, fragmented, and easily placated. Just try and take away the right for Germans to drink beer in the stands at football matches. I dare you. They halted games with tennis balls, chocolate coins, remote-controlled cars, and planes mounted with smoke bombs when the Bundesliga dared to propose selling off a portion of the league's media rights to private investors. Threaten their beer in the stands, something that was banned in England in 1985, and they'll turn into the French when the government threatens to increase their pension age. There would be riots on the streets of Stuttgart, ultras self-immolating in Hamburg, and government officials seeking refuge in Austria. Actually, I suppose it's normally Argentina where wanted German politicians go on the run, isn't it? But you get the general idea. It isn't actually the case that English football fans are powerless. We saw that in their swift, overwhelming, and ultimately highly effective opposition to the European Super League proposals. albeit they do definitionally have less entrenched power than German fans. We just don't see them coordinating that effectively and passionately about almost anything else. The cheaper tickets and the entrenched power that German football fans have, guaranteed by the 50+1 rule, doesn't just change the profile of supporters at Bundesliga games when compared to Premier League ones, but also their mentality and attitude towards the game itself. There has been a notable shift over the last 10 or more years in English football of fans becoming much more expectant and demanding. I think part of the reason may be social media, television, and the broader media ecosystem, which has successfully turned football into a TV show for a lot of people, rather than a pastime. Speaking from my own experience, it used to be the case at Hull City that booing was reserved for the most historically dreadful results or shameful performances. Now it is the norm after an underwhelming performance, a narrow defeat, or even a draw in a game that you were expected to win. You see this all the time now. We drew 1-1 with Portsmouth last weekend, and, in fairness, we were abysmal in the second half, against currently the worst team in the division, but the atmosphere throughout the game and at full time was toxic. After the match, Hull City's German manager Tim Walter, who is already skating on thin ice, essentially criticised that toxicity, stating that sometimes the players need help from supporters to get through tough moments in games. He is right, of course, although it does go both ways, but it seemed to hit upon a fundamental difference between modern English and German football fans, and, arguably, modern and not-so-modern English fans. But what do you really expect? Ticket prices in England have increased expectations. If you're paying the same price to watch a football match as a West End show, a lot of people expect to be entertained. And if they don't feel as though they're getting value for their money, they don't tend to see it as their duty to motivate the players, but the duty of the players to excite them and give them something to shout about. It is a much more reactive experience where the crowd, and by extension the atmosphere, is responding to what is happening on the pitch more so than attempting to influence it. In other words, most English football fans see themselves as an audience, only a small percentage still view their role as being that of an active participant. In Germany, by contrast, tickets are much cheaper, as we've established, so there is less of a sense of, okay, entertain me now, I have paid a lot of money for this. But fundamentally, German football fans, or members at least, which make up the vast majority of attendances, are literally part of the club in the sense that they collectively own the teams, with the exception of Bayer Leverkusen and Wolfsburg. It's only natural, therefore, that German fans should feel a greater sense of unity, togetherness, and collective responsibility with the teams and players they're watching, compared to fans of Premier League clubs, which are invariably now owned by foreign oligarchs, nation-states, or American asset management companies, and couldn't feel much more distant from the fans if they tried. Except for this guy, of course. He feels a deep attachment to his club's owners, which is great to see. Another complaint about atmospheres in English stadiums relates to the architecture of the grounds themselves in terms of their size and design. It's not uncommon now, due to how spread out vocal sections of supporters sometimes are, to hear 2 or even 3 chants being sung by the same set of supporters in different parts of the stadium at the same time. The sloped, bowl-shaped design of almost all modern stadiums in England is also in sharp contrast to old-school English stadiums, which tended to be steep, intimate, and gave a feeling of being right on top of the pitch. West Ham are perhaps the worst offenders on this front, due to the haphazard conversion of London's 2012 Olympic Stadium. German stadiums are among the most modern and well-appointed anywhere in the world, but they have done so, for the most part, while maintaining that sense of intimacy and tightness. I was struck at the Euros by how steep, for example, the top tier of Dortmund's Westfalenstadion is, while maintaining an outstanding view from just about every part of the ground, and giving the feeling of compactness in a stadium with a regular capacity over 80,000, making it larger than any Premier League ground. A popular argument on social media for why atmospheres in England are so bad at the moment is also woke. Yes, we are doing the Sean Dyche meme. I've seen lots of people make the point that a lot of chants at football matches in the 90s or 2000s would be considered racist, sexist, or homophobic today, what with them being racist, sexist, or homophobic and all, and that, as a result, modern sensibilities and political correctness have frustrated English football fans, creating dull and quiet atmospheres. Again, I return to my point about drunk young men tending to be the loudest fans, at least in the Western world, so silly as that may sound, this isn't an argument that I dismiss out of hand. When I first started following Hull City, you're going home in a f***ing ambulance and you're gonna get your f***ing head kicked in were actual chants that real human beings would shout at one another on a regular basis. Very few people ever actually went home in an ambulance, or got their heads kicked in, thankfully, but it is marked how antiquated that sounds now, and I am not that old. I'm not. I'm really not. I could also remember going away to Brighton. This is only in 2011, by the way. We're not going back to the 1980s. Again, I am not that old, where the bulk of the chants could be boiled down to, "You're gay, and that's funny," and also several London away games, most notably one at West Ham in 2012, where there was a repeated chant, the synopsis of which was, "We're northern, so we beat our wives, but you're southern, so you're gay, and being gay is worse than beating your wife." Again, that was in 2012. I also remember chants taunting QPR fans after the 7/7 bombings in London, in which 56 people were killed and almost 800 were injured. Great bants. Look at what the woke brigade took from us. You can't even mock the victims of a deadly terrorist attack without someone claiming they're offended these days. I said that I don't dismiss this argument out of hand, but I do still dismiss it because even when those sorts of chants were more common and normalised, they were very rarely the loudest chants or the backbone of decent atmospheres. A chant which includes, "We go home, we beat our wives," naturally, is a little bit alienating, and not everyone is going to want to join in because, well, not everyone is scum, and some people are the wives. Likewise, the chant about the 7/7 bombing failed to spread beyond a pocket of human dung. The loudest chants throughout this period at Hull City were still benign, fun, or amusing, and I'm pretty sure, having gone away to lots of teams, that was the same everywhere. The Giovanni chant, just loudly, collectively, and then intermittently shouting, "You all," and a chant of 01482, which is the area code for landline telephones in Hull, were always much louder, and, at least as far as I'm aware, the woke haven't yet come for the area code chants, so I'm not sure that we can blame them for that one no longer getting a hearing. I mean, this looks pretty woke to me, a fight sexism banner in the Bundesliga, or this one which says, "For all who feel addressed, Nazis out." It doesn't get much more woke than that. And yet woke Bundesliga atmospheres still seem to be doing pretty well. Abraham Maslow famously stated that it is tempting, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. And likewise, if all you've got is culture war talking points, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were the fault of woke. If I were to do the same thing with my own cognitive biases, I think that you could make a far more compelling argument that the misery, cynicism, and pessimism that has become pervasive in the UK over the last 20 years is being reflected on the terraces, channeled not through anger or the proud British tradition of protest and dissent, but all too often a sense of apathy and resignation. If there were a mantra that summed up post-2008, or certainly post-2010 Britain, it would be that things can never get better. And anyone who says that they can is a childish imbecile deserving of ridicule. That is a much broader point, of course, which affects many areas of life in the UK, but equally, I think it helps to explain why English football fans are so placid and feeble compared to those on the continent and elsewhere in the world. As I said, you could make that case, but I won't. There are other issues, of course, VAR for one, which has undoubtedly lessened the experience of watching live Premier League games, and dulled the jubilation that fans feel able to express in the immediate aftermath of scoring a goal, which ought to be the high point in terms of atmosphere in any game, there is the enormous amount of football on TV these days, and the frequent mucking about by Sky and TNT when it comes to kickoff times, not just in the Premier League now, but throughout the EFL, with atmospheres inevitably being worse at 12 o'clock on a Sunday than they would be at the traditional 3 PM on a Saturday, and there appears to have been an acceleration in almost all of the problems that I have mentioned in this video, which impact atmospheres in the post-COVID era. There is also an argument that, as football has become so much more choreographed and positionally and tactically disciplined, with possession and ultimately control becoming king, the amount of chaos and entertainment in games, which inevitably increase the atmosphere in a country where crowds have always been reactive to a degree, as opposed to more orchestrated ultras elsewhere in the world, has had a detrimental effect on the amount of crescendos in terms of atmosphere and noise inside stadiums. I left those points until last because I find them to be the least compelling, but I included them all the same because, likewise, I don't think that they are entirely without merit. And if there is nothing else that you take from this video, just remember that the moon does have an atmosphere, it's just a very thin one called an exosphere. The joke now goes, what do English football stadiums and the moon have in common? Answer: they both have atmospheres, but they are so slight that, to the untrained eye, you could be forgiven for thinking that they don't. Admittedly, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same way as the scientifically inaccurate version. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it interesting or informative in any way. I obviously hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram or Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all three, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.